The following is a Silver Bullion Television audiocast. Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Silver Bullion Television, SBTV. I'm your host, Patrick Vieira. Today we have with us Mr. Collin Kettell, who is the CEO and partner of Palisade Global Investment Limited, a company with the goal of investing in and backing undervalued junior mining companies and other high-growth opportunities. Collin is also the host of Palisade Radio, the largest online interview platform in the resource sector. He regularly picks the brains of the luminaries in the resource and commodity sectors, providing his listeners with valuable investment insights. We are delighted to have him here today as our guest. Good day, Collin, and welcome to SBTV.
Patrick, thanks for having me on the program, and I appreciate you giving me an introduction. You've done a much better job than I would have tried to do.
Thank you, Collin. You're way too kind. You know, it looks like we're in the midst of a revolution. Let's call it an electric vehicle revolution. Just 10 years ago, there were virtually no electric cars on the road, and now in 2018, there's slightly over 1.2 million electric vehicles, including pure electric and hybrids that have been sold worldwide. Now, this number does still pale when compared to the sale of petrol and diesel vehicles globally, but still, it's quite a stunning development. Collin, what do you think were the main reasons underpinning such a development in the electric vehicle market?
Well, I think that there's quite a few factors that are going into this movement all at the same time. And I might start with where I was going back 18 months ago, which was a skeptic of the movement. Anytime that a movement appears to be backed by the governments of the world or by government tax credits, case in point in the United States, a lot of people are against Elon Musk because they perceive that Tesla has been built on the back of taxpayer dollars. It oftentimes creates a negative reaction, and people tend to shut off to the reality. But what started happening is more and more car makers began to announce initiatives of pumping not just small amounts of money into the space, but to the tune of billions of dollars. And I think at this point, Patrick, if you add up how many car makers have planned initiatives to move into the EV space and the amount of dollars that they've committed, you're talking somewhere in the range of $100 billion. And when companies of this size that are feeding the market worldwide for cars move into a space like this, I think that investors have to wake up and take to the fact that this is not some government-rooted plan that doesn't make sense anymore. It's in fact something that must have some economic backing. So on top of that, you also do have the government factor. The United States has probably fallen behind when looking at all of the major economies around the world in terms of pushing towards EV initiatives. But if you go to countries like India and China, which represent the second and soon to be third largest market for vehicles, those countries are both pushing very hard to move towards EVs. They have obvious pollution issues that they need to deal with. Pollution that tends to be centered in the middle of urban settings, and much of that pollution is due to too many cars, oftentimes diesel vehicles, emitting pollution into those population centers. So if you take the government factor and the car manufacturer factor, we have two major groups pointing in this direction. And that tells me that these groups have done the necessary work and due diligence to say that this is something real and it is happening. Now, what I started to do when I began to wake up to this about 18 months ago is started to look at the numbers. And while, as you pointed out, the EV and hybrid markets pale in comparison to the petro vehicles still sold, if you look at them on a growth curve, this is turning into a classic hockey stick. And so 2017 would have only represented around 1% to 2% of the overall cars being EV. But if you compare that to 2016 and 2015, it's a tremendous growth year over year in terms of how many of these cars are being produced. So looking kind of at the different groups making projections, if you listen to somebody like Elon Musk, who is obviously very invested in seeing this come to fruition, he's making outlandish claims that by 2030, over half of the vehicles on the road could be EV vehicles that year sold. More on the conservative side, I think a consensus has come that around 2025 to 2030, we could see somewhere in the range of 15 to 25% of new vehicle sales being some variation of EV or hybrid vehicles. And that's a tremendous move in a new direction in just a very short time period.
Collin, there are many people who are saying that this electric vehicle revolution or EV revolution, it's unstoppable already. Do you agree with this sentiment?
Yeah, I would certainly agree with you there, Patrick. I don't think that at this point the movement is going to stop. I think that it's well in motion. I think all the ingredients are in place to see this continue to pick up. And government regulations continuing to pile on and get further and further behind this. I would say at this point that's going to be your key factor in moving towards electrification. And there's also a couple other points that I did not bring up in my earlier answer, which is from a car manufacturing standpoint, in a few years' time, it's projected that the electric vehicles will actually reach cost parity and then drop below the cost of manufacturing a petrol vehicle. And it's also a lot easier if you think about the Tesla vehicle, for example, to build an electric vehicle than it is a petrol vehicle. It's much more simple. There's not a ton of components that are going into the vehicle, so the manufacturing process becomes a lot simpler, and that's all going to play into the hands of this EV movement.
Yeah, Collin, I'm listening to what you're saying, and I'd have to agree, because it seems like every time I go online or flip to the newspaper, I keep seeing country after country, and the government's calling for as much as even a ban on petrol and diesel engine vehicles in support of going electric. I know that China, by 2020, they want 12% of the new car sales to be zero emission. I believe Norway, they want, by 2025, they want their cars and vans to be zero emission. Even the Netherlands, they want new cars to be emission free by 2030. And I mean, we keep seeing this day after day after day. Lately, I've seen Indian government. Last year, I believe by 2030, they want their cars to be powered by electric vehicle batteries. The list is continuing to grow. And Collin, my question is, do you agree that all of this government support for zero emission outcome will accelerate the research, development, and adoption of electric vehicles?
Certainly. I mean, the amount of money that the government is able to plow into an initiative oftentimes seriously outweighs the amount of money that would naturally come from private investment. I think that the caveat to put there is that oftentimes governments pouring money into something, it's not always used in the most frugal and efficient manner, and so there will probably be a lot of waste. But I think that the amount of money will continue to accelerate, and these governments have a very good reason why they're trying to push for EVs.
Yeah, Collin, with all this news that's going on, I'm still trying to put a finger on it. If most of us know what's going on with electric vehicles, or if we're still asleep at the wheel, let's say. But the thing is, these cars, these EVs, electric vehicles, they are becoming very, very much more so stronger in terms of performance than even their petrol and diesel cousins. And it is a fact that the biggest contributing factor to this is the development of the batteries that power these electric vehicles. We see plans for gigafactories to be built by different groups in several countries that have been announced to produce the batteries to power these vehicles. And I think perhaps the most famous one, of course, is the Tesla gigafactory, where Elon Musk, he's announced that he intends to build 3 or 4 more of these mega factories. Could you share with us a little bit about either the composition of these lithium-ion batteries, or perhaps the metals that go into it, and the demand that's going to be coming on?
Certainly. There's several metals that go into the electrical vehicle movement. Things like nickel, cobalt. You also have lithium as a big one. Lithium-ion batteries will come to mind. And then you also have things like aluminum and manganese and copper wires, of course, tying together all of the cathode batteries inside of the vehicle. So as a resource investor, which is what we do at Palisade Global, We, of course, are looking at this huge demand curve that's being created and have worked to identify what we think are the metals that are going to benefit the most from this movement. Lithium has been a huge performer if you're a resource speculator or investor. Starting about 3 years ago, the early movers picking up on the name lithium ion, which is the standard battery going into these EVs, lithium really started to get a lift. A huge amount of money rushed in, and on the exploration and development side for lithium companies, there was a tremendous amount of capital that went into the space. Bringing that back to nickel and cobalt, we saw a similar run start in the cobalt space about 2 years ago. Cobalt is a necessary component of lithium-ion batteries. It's a significant portion of what keeps these batteries safe and stable so that they don't blow up. You might think back to the Samsung, I believe it was a S7 debacle that happened a couple years ago where Samsung didn't put enough cobalt in these batteries, and that's why they became unstable and started to explode. Cobalt has moved from about $10 a pound to over $43 a pound recently, and most people in the industry expect that this rise is going to continue, which is really a dramatic move for a resource. And then nickel is kind of the third metal that we found interesting, but has not moved yet very much. And nickel is certainly a bigger market. I can get into those numbers in a later question, but nickel is certainly a bigger market than cobalt and lithium globally. But there's also 6 to 8 times more nickel that's going into these lithium-ion batteries than cobalt or lithium. So it's the biggest component that's going into the batteries.
Yeah, Colin, I think anybody who looks at the charts and the government regulations and these things that are coming down the pike, it surely does look like nickel and cobalt are going to be in very, very high demand. Is it likely for any of these metals to be replaced with a cheaper alternative? Should their prices, let's say, get too high? Let's say if the supply starts to dwindle, what are the chances of some other metal replacing the current nickel and cobalt?
I'm not an expert on this space, but I rely on some very intelligent people, names like Mike Beck and Anthony Malowski, who are very close in the space. They've attended the Cathode Conference, which takes place out in California and comprises some of the smartest people in the space who are working to develop alternatives and other standards for batteries like solid-state lithium batteries, and even moving away from lithium into things like zinc batteries and a whole host of different potential future changes. What they've discovered is that essentially over the next 10 years, or probably up until 2030, lithium-ion batteries are the only type of battery that is going to be able to fuel this EV movement. And the components that go into the lithium-ion battery in its current state cannot change very much. A caveat being that nickel currently makes up 6 parts against cobalt and lithium in the standard battery, and that is already moving towards an 8-1-1 configuration. So that will cheapen the battery a bit because cobalt and lithium are expensive compared to what they used to be. But as a speculator or investor looking at how to best take advantage, I can say confidently that for the next 10 years, you don't have to worry about some drastically different battery type coming in and changing the landscape of what batteries go into these cars.
Knowing confidently that there's going to be a very high demand for nickel and cobalt, from the perspective of an investor, which of these metals would have the better investment prospect, nickel or cobalt?
I think that that's hard to point out. I think that nickel is unlikely to have the kind of rise that cobalt has already had from $10 to $44 and will continue to have. But of course, nobody likes to invest in something as much once it's already gone up 350%, as opposed to looking at something like nickel, which we like to say nickel is next for the EV revolution space. And nickel is pretty close to multi-year lows. So as a speculator, I think that nickel presents a very interesting opportunity where looking at lithium and cobalt, you've maybe already missed a good part of the move, and nickel is just starting to get picked up.
Now, yes, we do know that the, let's call it, the recipe for these batteries, they are changing, and currently it does look like there's going to be a 8 to 1 ratio where a battery could be 8 parts nickel to 1 part cobalt and 1 part lithium ion. Of course, there are other things that go into it, but these would be the three main, let's call them, ingredients. Knowing that nickel is going to play a much bigger role in EVs, and knowing that EVs are going to play a much bigger role in our lives, uh, would you say that nickel is a better investment as it can potentially have a better upside than cobalt from a price perspective?
Nickel certainly a key component, and that is not going to change. I think one thing that might help your listeners to understand the outlook for these markets, cobalt is the smallest of the three markets. It represents about 100,000 tons per year of production. And just to put that in comparison to something that people are more used to, the copper market is about 20 million tons a year. So cobalt is really, really quite small. And it's hard to increase the production because cobalt does not come out of primary cobalt mines. It's almost always a byproduct of copper and nickel production. So you have a very small market there. And as the demand for cobalt has gone up, it explains quite readily why the cobalt prices have swung so much to the high side, and a lot of people think it will continue moving that way. Lithium, similarly, a very small market, about 200,000 tons of lithium concentrate per year at this point are produced, and it's a bit easier to produce more lithium than it is cobalt because lithium does come from primary lithium deposits, either through brines or hard rock deposits worldwide. And so if you run a lithium operation right now, having just experienced the price of lithium going up so drastically, you can take advantage of that by making the necessary changes to produce more lithium and make the money that that's associated to upping the production in a higher price environment. Now, nickel is a bigger market. It's about 2 million tons per year. And there's two different kinds of nickel. This is where it gets very interesting. There's Class 1 nickel and Class 2 nickel. Class 1 nickel is your higher quality nickel. It's the nickel that goes into these batteries and is used for a whole host of high-tech sort of applications. That represents about 1 out of 2 million tons of that annual market. The other part of that is called Tier 2 or Class 2 nickel, and it's used in pig iron and the making of steel, and that is not applicable to these battery markets. What we're going to see, Patrick, over the next few years is if we hit a 25% adoption rate, the nickel market is going to have to increase from 2 million tons to 4 million tons. So that's a double, but if you look at the fact that all of that is going to be required in the Tier 1 market or the Class 1 market, you're actually looking at the tripling of 1 million tons up to 3 million tons of nickel. And for a market the size of nickel, 2 million tons a year, that's a pretty significant move that I think is going to create quite a drive up in the price of the commodity.
Colin, if you don't mind, I'd like to stay on the demand for a little bit longer. Now, I think it's a given. We both know that nickel and cobalt, they are going to be used much more often in the development of these EV batteries. Let's talk about the supply of these metals, since the forces of supply and demand often have an impact on prices. Now, currently it looks like about half of cobalt mine does come from the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC. And I think we all know the Congo, it can be kind of an iffy place. It can be kind of it's a hard place to really put your finger on and trust. You never know what's going to happen there because of the political instability, the unregulated business environments. We hear reports of outbreaks of ethnic violence, ethnic cleansing. It's a pretty dangerous place. Now, having said this, and knowing that quite a bit of the cobalt, roughly half of the cobalt mine, comes from the DRC, do you think that with all of this cobalt being mined from such a risky jurisdiction, that a constriction of cobalt could be very likely in the future, given that the potential demand for cobalt and electric vehicles are going to rise.
Certainly in mining, politics raises one of the biggest risks as an investor. I've asked that same question to people much closer to the cobalt market than myself, and they don't think that there is a significant risk of disruption in the DRC, which, as you pointed out, makes about half of the annual cobalt. If that were to happen, that would, of course, create quite a precarious situation for people trying to source cobalt worldwide. But the very interesting thing about cobalt is you don't even need a disruption in the supply chain to create this huge supply deficit that we're already seeing. So, I mean, just looking at the cobalt market overall, you make a great point. Not only do we have this small market, we have a metal that's a byproduct, so we can't readily produce more of it. It's also being produced in places like the DRC, Russia, and other very investor-unfriendly places around the world.
Yeah, Colin, outside of the DRC, do you think that the supply of cobalt mined from other jurisdictions such as Australia or even Canada could rival the DRC supply in the future?
There is simply no way at this point that in the next 10 to 20 year time frame that the production side of cobalt market is going to change dramatically. As pointed out, most cobalt's coming as a byproduct of nickel and copper, and it just so happens that a majority of that cobalt is located in the parts of the world where it's being mined right now. Any kind of new mine that comes online in Australia or in Canada is not going to make a significant dent on the overall picture of the market.
Colin, with all this talk about cobalt, nickel, I'd like to ask you, are you aware that silver bullion now allows clients to buy and store 250 kg drums of cobalt and nickel with us in Singapore?
I am, and Gregor, who's obviously the founder of Silver Bullion and a friend of mine, has been telling me that he's been working to put this together for some time. I know that there's not really a solution as a high net worth investor or an institution to play directly in these markets, so I'm excited to see that some headway is being made on your front to get to that point.
Yeah, you know, Colin, I've actually been down where we're storing the nickel and the cobalt. I can tell you it's the real deal. I mean, the purity is correct. It is the correct type of nickel, class 1 nickel, which is the ones that's needed for EV batteries. And my question is, do you think that having these actual physical EV metals will benefit investors who want to get in on the action of electric vehicle metals?
I think so. Commodities, I always like to say, move in tandem, and I've used this analogy so many times it's probably getting stale, but I like to compare it to a bike race where there's always this group of bikers in the middle of the peloton, and then there's a couple of commodities or that have broken away from the pack and a few lagging behind. It's nice as a commodity investor to be able to pick the metal that you want to get access to or that you want to get direct exposure to and have a vehicle whereby you can directly play that metal. It's very easy to buy gold. It's very easy to buy silver. In fact, you can even buy things like platinum, palladium, and rhodium. But when you're looking for a product to get direct exposure to cobalt, there's a couple ways to play it, but very few that are anything close to direct. And if I think that cobalt's going to go from $40 to $100 in the next 2 years, it's fantastic to now be able to buy physical cobalt, safely store it with a reputable group, and then have liquidity in a couple years' time when I decide that I want to then sell that metal. So I think Gregor is going to be surprised by the amount of demand that might come to silver bullion by way of this nickel and cobalt storage.
Yeah, Colin, I'd like to thank you for coming on the show. It was a pleasure to get your thoughts on the electric vehicle revolution. You know, it is exciting. It's very, very exciting. And to know that, again, people can actually buy the real physical and correct nickel and cobalt that is going to be in demand, or I should say already is in demand. it is something pretty special that silver bullion is bringing out, and we hope that people will take advantage of this, because what this is right now, it is truly a revolution, and that's why we call it an electric vehicle revolution. It is something that is going to be there in the future that we can get in on now. Collin, before you go, could you let our listeners know how they can follow your work and see what else is going on over at Palisade Radio?
Sure, Patrick. There are a couple ways. Your listeners can go to palisaderadio.com, which is the interview platform that I run, and we're talking to some of the biggest names in the industry each and every week. If you want to learn more about our investment company, Palisade Global Investments, just go to palisadeglobal.com. And finally, you can visit palisade-research.com to get our written work, which goes out each and every week. Feel free to put your email in at either of those sites and sign up for our free publications.
Thank you, Collin, for coming on the show. It was a pleasure to get your thoughts on the electric vehicle revolution.
Patrick, thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you also, Collin. Hope to see you again. That was Collin Kettell from Palisade Global Investments Limited with his views on the coming electric vehicle revolution. If you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to the SBTV channel to be updated on new content.